The first reports came in at 3:47 hours, fragmented and laced with static. An A-10 Thunderbolt II had been struck over the Helmand Valley during a close air support mission, trailing smoke and fire from both engines, last seen descending into a canyon network where Taliban forces had been massing for weeks. The pilot hadn't responded to repeated radio calls. Command assumed the worst. By dawn, the incident was being logged as a probable loss, and the search and rescue teams were already plotting recovery coordinates for wreckage and remains. But something strange happened 3 hours later. A blip appeared on radar, moving west at low altitude, hugging the terrain with the kind of precision that suggested either a very skilled pilot or a very desperate one. The signature matched an A-10. The same A-10. Call sign, Reaper 7. Ground control tried to make contact, their voices tight with disbelief. Nothing. Just the ghost of a radar return flickering through the mountains like a rumor refusing to die. The aircraft was moving, but barely, engines screaming at frequencies that shouldn't have been possible. Both GETF-34 turbofans were compromised, hemorrhaging fuel and fire, visible even from satellite imagery as twin trails of orange flame carving through the pale Afghan sky. It should have fallen. It should have exploded, it should have been impossible, but it kept flying. Major Kira Voss had always been underestimated, not because she lacked skill. Her record was flawless, her gunnery scores in the top percentile, her tactical decision-making sharp as a blade. But she was quiet, she didn't boast. She didn't fit the mold of the brash, loud fighter jock that Hollywood loved and the Air Force quietly rewarded. She'd earned her call sign, Reaper, not through bravado but through cold, methodical lethality. When she was in the air, things died. Quietly. Efficiently. Without fanfare. Her squadron respected her, but they didn't celebrate her. She was the pilot they called when everything had already gone wrong, when the mission was ugly and the odds were grim. She was the one who brought people home, but she never made it look heroic. She made it look inevitable. That was her gift, and her curse. The mission briefing had been standard. Taliban forces were advancing on a coalition outpost near the Arghandab River. Air support was requested. Reaper 7 was tasked with providing gun runs to suppress enemy positions while ground forces repositioned. It was supposed to be routine, but routine died the moment the first RPG tore through her starboard engine. The explosion was immediate and catastrophic. The A-10 shuddered, alarms screaming, fire warning lights flooding the cockpit in red. Kira's hands moved without thought, muscle memory overriding panic, cutting fuel to the damaged engine, adjusting trim, fighting the aircraft as it yawed hard right. She was 3,000 feet above hostile terrain, surrounded by mountains, with smoke pouring into the cockpit and her instruments flickering like dying stars. Her wingman, call sign Havoc 2, was shouting over the radio. "Reaper 7, you're on fire. Eject. Eject." But Kira didn't eject. She knew the math. If she punched out here, she'd land in a valley crawling with insurgents. She'd be captured or killed within minutes. The outpost below was still under fire. The soldiers down there were counting on her. So instead, she made a choice that defied every regulation, every safety protocol, every instinct for self-preservation. She banked hard left, bleeding altitude, and lined up for one more gun run. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon roared to life, 30mm rounds tearing into the earth at 70 rounds per second, a sound like the sky itself splitting open. Dust and flame erupted across the enemy position. Taliban fighters scattered. The ground forces reported suppression successful, but the second engine was failing now too. Another hit, another explosion, and suddenly Kira was flying a dying machine, both turbofans trailing fire, hydraulics bleeding, control surfaces barely responding. Havoc 2 was screaming. "Reaper 7, you are not going to make it. Eject now." Kira's voice came back, calm as winter. "Negative, I'm bringing her home." The radio fell silent, not because there was nothing to say, but because no one believed her. The A-10 was built to take punishment, famous for its survivability, but this was beyond reason. Both engines compromised, fuel burning, airframe shaking itself apart, and she was still 50 miles from friendly airspace. The odds were zero. The math was impossible, but Kira Voss had never been very good at accepting impossible. She descended into the canyon network, flying so low that her landing gear nearly scraped the ridgelines, using the terrain to mask her radar signature, to hide from the inevitable SAM systems that would be tracking her. The mountains rose around her like walls, jagged and unforgiving, and the A-10 groaned with every maneuver, metal screaming, rivets popping, the entire airframe threatening to come apart. Smoke filled the cockpit. She couldn't see the horizon. She was flying on instruments alone, trusting her gauges even as they flickered and died one by one. Her oxygen mask tasted like burning plastic. Her gloves were slick with sweat, but her hands stayed steady on the stick. She had flown this bird for 3 years. She knew its quirks, its tolerances, its stubborn refusal to quit. The A-10 wasn't elegant. It wasn't fast. It was a flying tank, a gun with wings, and it had been designed for exactly this, to absorb punishment and keep fighting. Kira whispered to it like a prayer. "Come on, girl, stay with me." The engines roared, bleeding fire into the sky, and somehow, impossibly, the aircraft obeyed. Command was listening now. Every radio in the theater was tuned to Reaper 7's frequency. Controllers were pulling up her telemetry, watching the impossible trajectory, the flickering vitals of a dying aircraft that refused to die. Someone muttered, "She's flying on fumes and willpower." Another voice, quieter, said, "She's already dead, she just doesn't know it yet." But Kira wasn't dead. She was calculating distance to base, fuel remaining, engine output, rate of descent. She was a mathematician of survival, and the equation was brutal. She didn't have enough fuel to make it back. She didn't have enough altitude to glide. She didn't have enough engine power to maintain level flight. By every measure, she was already a corpse flying a coffin. But she kept flying. She nursed the throttles, coaxing every last ounce of thrust from the burning engines. She trimmed the aircraft to minimize drag, flying with a precision that bordered on supernatural. And slowly, agonizingly, the distance to base began to shrink. 50 miles, 40, 30. The fire was spreading. The airframe was disintegrating, but she was still airborne. The tower at Kandahar airfield spotted her on approach, and the controller's voice cracked. "Reaper 7, we have you visual. Jesus Christ, you're on fire. Do you need foam on the runway?" Kira's response was flat, emotionless. "Affirmative, I'm coming in hot." The control tower erupted. Crash crews scrambled. Fire trucks raced onto the tarmac. Every pilot on the base stopped what they were doing and turned to watch. The A-10 appeared on the horizon, a black silhouette against the dawn, trailing twin columns of flame like a comet falling to Earth. It was barely flying, more gliding, more falling with style, and the roar of its dying engines echoed across the airfield like a death rattle. Kira had no flaps, no hydraulics, no working instruments. She was flying by feel alone, judging speed and altitude by the vibration of the stick, the sound of the wind, the gut instinct of a pilot who had long since stopped trusting machines and learned to trust herself. She lined up with the runway, dropped the landing gear manually, and committed to the landing. There was no go-around, no second chance. This was it. The A-10 slammed onto the runway hard, sparks exploding from the landing gear, tires shredding, the entire airframe buckling under the impact. Foam trucks sprayed her immediately, smothering the flames, but the momentum was too much. The aircraft skidded, veered left, and finally came to rest on the grass beside the runway, nose down, tail up, smoke billowing. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the canopy popped. Kira Voss climbed out, slow and stiff, covered in soot and hydraulic fluid, her flight suit torn, her face streaked with sweat and grime. She looked at the wreckage of her aircraft, at the twisted metal and charred engines, and allowed herself one small, exhausted breath. Then she turned and walked toward the debriefing building without a word. The ground crew stood in stunned silence. Someone whispered, "How the hell is she alive?" No one had an answer, but the story had already begun to spread. Reaper 7 had come back from the dead. The debriefing room was cold and clinical, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the smell of stale coffee and old paper thick in the air. Kira sat across from 3 senior officers, her hands folded on the table, her expression unreadable. They asked questions. She answered them, factual, precise. No embellishment. She described the hits, the engine failures, the decision to continue the mission, the flight back. She spoke like she was reading from a checklist, each word measured, each detail exact. The officers exchanged glances. One of them, a colonel with silver hair and a chest full of ribbons, leaned forward. "Major Voss, you understand that what you did was reckless. You endangered yourself in the aircraft. You violated multiple safety protocols." Kira met his gaze, unflinching. "With respect, sir, I made the call I thought was right. The ground team needed support. I provided it." The colonel frowned. "You could have ejected. You could have saved yourself." Kira's jaw tightened just slightly. "And left those soldiers to die? No, sir, I couldn't." The room fell silent. Another officer, younger, cleared his throat. "Major, do you understand how close you came to not making it back?" Kira's voice was quiet but firm. "I understand, sir, I was there." The story spread faster than wildfire. By noon, every pilot in the squadron had heard. By evening, it had reached every base and theater. By the next morning, it was on the news. Female A-10 pilot survives double-engine failure over Afghanistan. The headlines were sensational, but the details were what captivated people. The impossibility of it, the sheer defiance of physics and fate. Kira became an overnight sensation, though she hated it. Reporters requested interviews. She declined. The Air Force wanted to use her story for recruitment. She refused. She didn't want fame. She didn't want glory. She just wanted to fly, but her squadron treated her differently now. The quiet respect had turned into something louder, something she couldn't ignore. They started calling her Phoenix behind her back, though the name never stuck. She was still Reaper, always would be. But the way they looked at her had changed. Before, she had been competent. Now she was legendary. And legends, she was learning, carried a weight all their own. 3 weeks later, Kira was back in the cockpit. A new A-10, same call sign, Reaper 7. The maintenance crew had painted a small phoenix rising from flames on the nose, a tribute she hadn't asked for but didn't have the heart to remove. She ran her hand over it before pre-flight, feeling the texture of the paint, the heat of the metal beneath. The crew chief, a grizzled tech sergeant named Alvarez, watched her with something like reverence. "She's ready for you, ma'am. Checked her twice myself." Kira nodded. "Thanks, Alvarez." He hesitated, then spoke again. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me saying, what you did up there, it was the bravest damn thing I've ever seen." Kira looked at him, surprised. "I was just doing my job." Alvarez shook his head. "No, ma'am, you were doing a lot more than that." She didn't know how to respond, so she just climbed into the cockpit. The familiar smell of jet fuel and leather, the weight of the helmet, the hum of the instruments powering up. This was home. This was where she made sense. Her next mission was uneventful. CAS over a village near Kabul, no contact, no drama. She returned to base, filed her report, and tried to slip back into the rhythm of routine. But routine had changed. Other pilots sought her out now, asking for advice, for tips, for stories. She deflected as best she could, but the attention was relentless. One evening, sitting in the rec room, a young lieutenant approached her, fresh out of flight school, eager and nervous. "Major Voss, can I ask you something?" Kira sighed inwardly but nodded. "Shoot." The lieutenant hesitated. "When you were up there, both engines on fire, did you ever think about giving up?" Kira considered the question. Honest answer, or the answer he wanted to hear. She chose honesty. "Every second, but thinking about giving up and actually giving up are two different things. I thought about it, I just didn't do it." The lieutenant frowned, processing. "How do you make that choice?" Kira's eyes were distant. "You remember why you're up there. It's not about you. It's about the people counting on you." Months passed. The war ground on. Kira flew mission after mission, her reputation growing with each sortie. She was requested by name now by ground commanders who had heard the stories, who wanted Reaper 7 overhead when the bullets started flying. She was the pilot you called when the situation was desperate, when the odds were impossible, when you needed someone who would not quit no matter what. And she never did. But the weight of it began to show. The sleepless nights, the flashbacks, the phantom smell of smoke in her quarters. She didn't talk about it. She didn't have to. Every pilot in theater carried the same scars, some visible, some not. They understood. One night, sitting alone on the flight line, staring up at the stars, she felt someone sit down beside her. Havoc too. His real name was Marcus, a tall, lanky pilot from Texas with a slow drawl and a quick smile. He'd been her wingman for over a year. "You doing okay, Reaper?" Kira didn't look at him. "Define okay," Marcus chuckled softly. "Fair point." They sat in silence for a while, the desert wind cool against their skin. Finally, Marcus spoke again. "You know, I thought you were dead that day. I really did," Kira nodded. "So did I." Marcus looked at her, his expression serious. "Why didn't you eject?" Kira's voice was barely a whisper. "Because if I did, I'd have to live with knowing I left those soldiers behind. And I couldn't do that." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's why you're the best pilot I know." Kira smiled just a little. "I'm not the best, I'm just stubborn," Marcus laughed. "Same thing." The deployment ended. Kira rotated back stateside to an assignment at Nelly's Air Force Base in Nevada. She thought distance from the war would bring relief, but it didn't. The nightmares followed her. The weight followed her. She attended ceremonies, accepted medals she didn't want, gave speeches she didn't believe in. The Air Force paraded her as a symbol of resilience, of courage, of everything they wanted their pilots to be, and she hated it because she didn't feel brave. She felt tired. One afternoon, standing in front of a classroom of young cadets, she was asked the question again. "Major Voss, what was going through your mind when both engines were on fire?" She paused, looking at their eager faces, their hungry eyes. They wanted a story. They wanted inspiration. She gave them the truth instead. "I was terrified. I thought I was going to die. But fear doesn't mean you stop. It just means you're human." The room was silent. She continued. "Being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing it anyway. That's all it is." One cadet raised her hand. "How do you learn to do that?" Kira thought about it. "You don't learn it, you just do it. And then you do it again, and again, until it becomes who you are." Years later, long after she had retired from active duty, Kira found herself back at an airfield, a memorial service for a pilot who had died in training. She stood among the crowd, anonymous in her civilian clothes, watching as the young faces grieved. She thought about all the missions, all the close calls, all the moments where the line between life and death had been impossibly thin. She thought about the soldiers she had saved, the lives she had protected, the people who had gone home because she refused to give up. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something close to peace. After the service, a young woman approached her, a lieutenant barely out of her 20s. "Excuse me, are you Major Kira Voss?" Kira blinked, surprised. "Used to be just Kira now." The lieutenant's eyes widened. "I read about you in flight school. You're Reaper 7. You're the reason I became a pilot." Kira felt something tighten in her chest. "I'm just a pilot, nothing special." The lieutenant shook her head firmly. "No, ma'am. You're more than that. You showed us it's possible, that even when everything's falling apart, you can still make it home." Kira looked at her, this young woman with fire in her eyes and determination in her voice, and saw herself decades ago. "What's your call sign?" The lieutenant smiled. "Phoenix 3. Kira laughed, genuine and warm. "Of course it is." They stood together looking out at the runway, at the aircraft lined up like soldiers gleaming in the afternoon sun. The lieutenant spoke again. "Do you miss it, flying?" Kira nodded. "Every day, but I did my time. Now it's your turn." The lieutenant straightened as if receiving an order. "I won't let you down, ma'am." Kira put a hand on her shoulder. "You won't. Just remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about not giving up. Ever." The lieutenant nodded, saluted, and walked away. Kira watched her go, feeling the torch pass, feeling the weight lift just a little. She had been the one they called when everything was falling apart. Now there were others. Others who would carry the burden, who would fly into the fire, who would bring people home no matter the cost. Her story had become their story, and that, she realized, was the only legacy that mattered. She turned and walked toward the parking lot, the desert sun warm on her face, the sound of jet engines roaring in the distance. Somewhere above, an A-10 climbed into the sky, its silhouette stark against the blue, and Kira smiled. The Reaper had passed the blade, and the fight, the eternal fight to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, would go on. Not because of glory, not because of fame, but because there were still people willing to fly into the fire, to push past fear, to refuse the easy answer of surrender. Kira Voss had been one of them, and now she had helped create others. That was enough. That was everything. She climbed into her car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving the airfield behind. But the sky, the endless sky, stayed with her. It always would.